So, Jon and Brett, thank you so much for joining us on the Team Us podcast. We're really excited to talk to you guys. And I always love to hear how couples met, but we don't have a lot of time. So, Jon, in your book, you said that you are an extrovert's extrovert and Brett is an introvert's introvert. And because of that, your marriage almost didn't happen. So, can you give us just kind of a speed, like a 3 minute or less, on how you met and ended up together?
Yeah, so I think a common theme that you'll find during this interview is we probably remember things differently. And so how I remember this is she was a freshman, I was a sophomore in college. We were at this freshman mixer and I remember like seeing her and like talking to her and then talking to a lot of other people because that's what I do. But how she sees it is that like I was talking to her and then I was just like midway conversation. I just was like, okay, next person, and just went and started talking to someone else. And so I'm like, I don't know. I was like moving around the room. I gave you your time and then we just, but she was like, no, like you totally like stiffed me. So that's why like it almost never happened. Um, but luckily I knew her sister who was actually a grade ahead of me. And her sister's like, I think you should give him another chance. Is that pretty close, babe?
That's pretty close. Yes. Everyone kept saying give him another chance. So I ended up making the first move with he would say what did it for him was my yellow shoes, my yellow high-heeled shoes. And what did it for me was watching him. He's a drummer. And watched him lead in a worship band and drumming. So I went up after that and made the first move of, hey, let's go out. So
I get that. Ted was playing keyboards and organ in a worship band when we met. There's something about a musician,
just
you
something
know?
about a musician. So true.
Yeah. I love that. That's really it's really cool just to hear how what God does to bring us together. So, in 2014, Jon, you had an epiphany as far as your anxiety and OCD, and it involved Brett and Splenda. So, can you share that
Yeah.
story and how that epiphany has, helped your marriage and helped your relationship?
Yeah, so again, I think this is one where Brett usually it's great that Brett gets to be included in this interview because again, she tells this story a little differently. So I think it's great to get her perspective as well. So my perspective is this. So I mean, growing up, I always knew there was something different about me. There was just like thoughts I couldn't get out of my head. There were things I would ruminate on, and that I'd just get hung up on. And I think I just kind of came to like think like, okay, that's just who I am, right? But as marriage has a tendency to refine us, um, as Brett and I traveled down the road of marriage and a few years into it, and I think at this point, we were probably about 3 years into our 4 years into our marriage. Um, we were living downtown Dallas and this cool loft and we're like, hey, let's like walk around the city. And so we went down, there was a coffee shop below us, and Brett was gonna grab us coffee and I was gonna run to the bathroom. And I said, hey, just make sure there's no Splenda. Like I want sweet and low. I like the pink packets. She's like, yeah, I got it. So I went to the bathroom, came back, she hands me my coffee, and I just do like a classic spit take. Like I'm just like, what the heck? I was like, you put Splendid. She's like, no. I mean, I told them to put sweet. No, and I just like I I could not stop thinking about that. Right, like it was so infuriating to me. Why? I don't know. And so it ruined our entire weekend. And Brett, finally, I mean, we didn't talk for a day or day and a half, and finally she's like, listen, you got to get help. And she was really broken down. And I think when you see the person you love in front of you saying something's not right, she's like, I'm not leaving, but listen, we gotta get this figured out. And so that was the impetus for me to go and say, okay, I think I shouldn't get that mad about Sweet and Low versus Splenda, you know? So that was really, I went to the psychiatrist and really was able to finally name what was going on. And I think, you know, when we name stuff in our lives, right, it starts to lose power, right? If you go back to the garden, it's like our job was to name the animals, and that kind of showed the hierarchy of dominion, right? So when I was able to name what was going on inside of me, which was then I was diagnosed with anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, I gained a power over it. That's not to say it went away, right? But I just finally knew what I was dealing with. Before it was like I was punching in the dark, and now it was like the lights were on and I knew exactly what my enemy was. So that's my version, Brett.
Yes. This is something after he wrote his book on this is something we had to learn. We didn't know that our memories of certain instances were so different until he wrote this book. And that was a hard thing for me. Like, that is not how I remember it. So the Splenda, for me, the epiphany that I had, it was just like you said, it was going to be a great weekend, beautiful weather. I was going to go get the coffee, and he does the spit take. And then kind of what is not in his memory is his overt, loud, angry reaction towards it. So he has this reaction and then storms out. And it was so big that I had neighbors come up to me and ask me if I was safe, if I was okay, if I needed to get help. And that for me was the first time where I was like, oh, other people are noticing that something's off. Because I think with anxiety, OCD, so much of it manifests internally at home behind closed doors rather than outwardly. So that was one of the first times where I recognized that other people actively saw something off. And so that really kind of led to me ultimately breaking down and telling Jon, like, we can't live like this anymore. Like, something has to give. I don't know what that is, but something's got to give.
That is like fascinating to think about how, because I'm sure you guys are not the only couples who remember things differently. So how have you learned, how has that helped you better communicate or better understand each other, just to know that? Like, what do you do now when you face conflict? Do you talk about, okay, here's how I perceived the situation, or what do you do, and what can you recommend to other couples who are maybe listening and going, oh, okay, this is sounding familiar?
So I think for me, I think we've each had to deal with it differently. So what's interesting is generally although it's not the case in this instance, right? Which is funny, but generally I am a person that, like, I'm very factual, right? Like, I tell a story and I give all the details. Like Brett's like, can you land the plane already? You know what I mean? Like, and Brett more so remembers feelings, right, or generalities, right, and you know, might fill in the details. And so for me, sometimes I'm like, I remember we had a conversation. I'm like, Brett, you're lying about that. She's like, I'm not lying about that. What do you mean? You know? And so but then it's interesting. Like, we looked this up and realized that no, that it's not. Like, there are two ways to kind of remember things, right? And we just tend to remember them differently. And so I think for me personally, I've had to come to just be like, I appreciate that about her, right? Or know that, like, if she leaves out a detail that I think is important, right? It's not that she's trying to, you know, manipulate. It's not trying to, like, misremember. It's not trying to mislead, right? And then at the heart of what that comes down to, and this is, you know, we've gone to marriage counseling in the past, and we're not afraid to admit that, is it comes down to believing the best, right? And so I think a lot of times couples start to get tripped up because they fall into these things where they're like, your friend tells you something, your family member tells you something, and you're willing to like kind of gloss over, oh, well, this is what they really meant, right? Or whatnot. But our spouse does something like that, and we're like, yeah, no, what? No, you know what I mean? Like we're just not willing to give them the benefit of the doubt and believe the best in them. And so I think that's what we've learned, is that we need to believe the best in each other. And so if Brett misses a detail or doesn't remember a detail, or if like in the Splenda case, I don't remember a detail or I miss a detail, Brett's gotten to the point, like Brett's not thinking that I'm out there trying to whitewash that story. I literally just don't remember it that way, right? And as I've gotten even into therapy in the last year again, it's amazing what your mind does, what your amygdala does as you go through traumatic experiences and how you remember them. Like it's scientific that people can remember. Actually they say, and I was listening to a podcast on this the other day, eyewitness testimony is some of the most unreliable testimony that there is. Right? Why? Because like two people can literally watch the same thing and see and remember two different things. Right? So especially when it comes to a traumatic experience, which this was for Brett, this was for me, which I'm not trying to hijack that term, right? I've come to learn that word traumatic experience covers a lot more than we think it does. Is celebrating and just coming to the point that like, yeah, we can remember things differently, and that's okay.
Yeah, that you are teammates. You're on the same team. You're working together. And if you believe the best about it, that's what you do with a teammate, is you believe the best about them rather than make them an adversary. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Right. We just got through March Madness recently. It's like someone throws an errant pass, it's like, okay, was that person honestly wasn't trying to turn the ball over. They didn't want to turn the ball over. They just thought you were going to make a different cut, right? They thought you were going to cut to the basket. They thought you were going to cut out. So they threw it. It's like their best of intention was to complete the pass and get a bucket, right? It wasn't to turn the ball over, right? But how many times in our relationships do we treat our spouse like they're trying to turn the ball over instead of actually make a good pass?
right. And I think, Ted, you and I have to remind ourselves of this sometimes, because we try to do that too, believe the best, but we do have moments. Like we had one the other day where he said something to me and I put extra meaning into it. And he's like, wait a minute, let's go back to that. Let's retalk that. Why did you jump here? And so I thought that was really helpful, just to have those little conversations that are like course correcting and to remind us that we should continue to believe the best about each other, even in just the day-to-day conversations.
Well, and I think that hits a good point too, is Jon interprets my tone and him very differently sometimes than how we mean it. And how somebody interprets a tone also affects how they will remember a particular event. And then because of that, how they react is different. I mean, we've had so many kind of quote unquote tiffs, right? That could have turned really big if we hadn't stopped and be like, hey, babe, you're really upset about something that happened. Let's kind of replay and figure out, because I'm thinking in my head, like we had this issue in the car a while ago where I said and did something and he just shut down. And I'm like playing in my head, I'm like, well, I closed the door. I said this, like what went on? And then when he replayed to me how he interpreted it and remembered what just happened, it was totally different than the tone that I had meant it for it to be. And his reaction made so much more sense after he explained it. So I think understanding that we all interpret tones differently, even if we have no malintent in our tone, it can be interpreted, especially when there's anxiety at play and previous past trauma at play. There are so many kind of triggers that Jon and I have had to identify and work through, particularly with things that I will say that aren't with no malintent, but it triggers something in him. So that communication has been key. And I say that with like, it didn't happen overnight and we're still working on it. So, but just communicating why we're feeling, why we reacted certain ways, how we remember something has been so important to us.
Yeah, we like to say that practice makes progress, not perfection. Like we will practice things in our marriage and hopefully we'll get better, but we still have those moments where we fall back into an old pattern and we have to go, okay, wait a minute. What are we doing here? So I
Absolutely.
love that you bring up just not just words, but your tone. I mean, your body language can communicate things. So, Jon, in your book, you talk about reaching a point in your marriage where the two of you just couldn't communicate. I don't know if that was before the Splenda incident or after, but you say that it felt helpless and hopeless. So I'd love to hear like how you walked through that, how anxiety played a part of it, and what you did to find help and hope.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is, I think the Splenda Sweet and Low incident is the culmination of those feelings and that of, especially when, so dealing with anxiety and OCD, I think, what happens is physiologically, my body goes into fight or flight mode, at the smallest things, right? So things that a quote unquote normal person can just take in stride, they literally send my body into fight or flight mode. So I think about how that deals or how that wreaks havoc on communication. Well, we just kind of got a little bit of a taste, right? In even what we're just talking about, which is, Brett can say something or could say something, right? And it's gotten a lot better. Doesn't mean it's completely gone, but Brett would say something that would trigger something inside of me, my fight or flight response, right? So, like she was saying, it's like the smallest thing, hey, why don't we X, Y, and Z, right? Whatever it is. And that would trigger that fight or flight response, right? And that is a physiological, it's a physical response inside of me. The cortisol, the adrenaline starts going, like all that kind of stuff, and it makes it impossible for me to calm down or stop thinking about it. So since then, though, right, since that Splenda incident, as I have named it, like I said in the beginning, and been able to understand what's going on, and then I've been able to treat that, right? So treating my anxiety, treating my OCD through what I call like a three-pronged method of brain, body, and spirit, right? So brain, I take medication, right? Because there are synapses in my brain that don't fire properly, right? That kick that fight or flight response in at those tiny little things. So that's one way. Body is physical exercise. I've lost a lot of weight, and just being more active, right? And then spirit, right? There are spiritual issues, right, that I've had to deal with, right? And by the way, just when I thought I was done with them, right, this last year, God's like, nope, you got another one, And so it's treating those three things that have allowed our communication to, I think, be leaps and bounds. I mean, I don't even know how we got through our first, especially our second year of marriage. People say the first year of marriage is hard. For us, it was our second year of marriage. We were like living in this roach infested garden level apartment in New York City, with like one window unit air conditioner, black mold, and no sunlight, It's like, thank the Lord we got through that. But I would say that we're leaps and bounds better, wouldn't you, Brett?
Yeah, I think there was, for at least us and so many other couples that I've talked to, that once Jon got diagnosed, it was just it didn't fix anything in the diagnosis itself, but it just turned the lights on for so many things. Because as the spouse for so many years, I mean, I'd never been married before. I honestly didn't really date at all before him. So like my relationship with him was all that I knew. And so when we just couldn't communicate on the smallest things, or I would say something and it would trigger PTSD for him, or an OCD spiral or anxiety spiral, and his body at those points literally were in fight or flight, where he had the inability to verbalize anything. I mean, he was all but literally in paralysis. I mean, that's the only way, right, Jon, that I can explain what would happen to his body. There was like nothing there. And that would,
Yeah,
that would,
because I think there's fight or flight, but what I've come to realize is it's actually fight, flight, or freeze. And so a lot of people just say, oh, fight or flight, you're either going to run or you're going to fight. And it's actually, no, there's a third option, freeze. And that's actually what I would do. I would go into freeze mode a lot.
yeah. And so to me as the spouse, I never had confidence issues before, identity issues, but I began to really internalize his reactions as a me problem, that I was saying something wrong, that I was doing something wrong, that I wasn't being the quote unquote good submissive wife that was supportive. And so I began to really kind of crumble inside, and then I began to get snippy at him. And so it just become this vicious cycle. And so once he got that diagnosis, it did different things for both of us. For me, what that meant is there is a physiological medical condition that he has. Now there's things that he needs to do and take ownership of, absolutely. But he is not just out to get me. You know, my husband is not a bad man. In fact, he's a wonderful man. And so this was almost, it made sense. It put so many pieces of the puzzle together of like, man, this Jon that I married, all these incidences, like this doesn't match up to the Jon I dated, because we were long distance. So we weren't like physically together very often at all. So this was all very new to us. And so it was a huge piece of the puzzle for us.
That's awesome. And I love how, Jon, in your book, Finding Rest, you really do unpack that holistic approach. You know, I think it's is it a 3-stool?
That's right. Yeah, it's a stool. Your mental
is?
health sits on the top, and then you need the 3 legs of the stool.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful book, especially for people who may have, not only for someone who's going through it, but for people who have someone in their life and they're going through it and they're going, why do I feel like I'm walking on eggshells when I'm communicating? Or it's very, very helpful, is what I found as reading it. Okay, so if the two of you were sitting across the table from a couple whose marriage is affected by similar things, you know, anxiety, OCD, what would you say to them? How would you encourage them?
I think, Brett, you should go first from the loved one's perspective.
Yeah, I think our advice would be twofold, from the sufferer and the spouse. I wish I would tell them kind of what I wish I could have heard, which is, one, that my identity, your identity, is not in being the spouse, right? My identity is as a daughter of God. And that is being the spouse, being that support. That's a role that I play, but that is not my identity. And I think I had gotten so deep, dark in a hole that became my identity, being the spouse of someone that I didn't understand, that was that we couldn't communicate, and it was dark and hard. And so recognizing that that's not your identity, but then also recognizing that while he is going through his stuff, that you need to seek help yourself. And there's so much support out there for the sufferer, for the anxiety sufferer, OCD sufferer, to go and get therapy and ways to cope. And that is so important. But there is like nothing out there for us as spouses. And so I have said this so many times. I had a coffee date with a gal 2 weeks ago, and I told her just this, of like, you need to go and you need to seek a therapist and you need to seek help for yourself, because you are going through trauma as well. What you are seeing is, and what you are feeling and hearing, and there's the walking on eggshells, being gaslit for a long time, those can do something to somebody's psyche, and that demands a therapist as well.